an unusual ally in the fight to limit the effects of climate change.
Imagine a river with no water, cracked earth, scorched roots, and grasses crisped under temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The San Pedro River Basin, once lush and thriving, had become a barren wasteland. Wildlife vanished, groundwater disappeared, and by 2015, even local towns had surrendered hope. Then something strange began, something no one could rationally explain. The desert experiment begins. Back in the mid-20th century, the idea sounded almost unbelievable, even to the people who came up with it. The American Southwest was in trouble. Rivers that once teemed with fish and birds were vanishing. Native plants were disappearing. Ranching, dam building, and heavy groundwater pumping had left the land cracked and sun-baked, barely able to hold life. Scientists were desperate for a solution that didn't involve expensive machines or massive infrastructure. Then a small group of wildlife managers proposed something almost crazy: to release beavers into the desert. These weren't just any animals. Beavers had vanished from huge parts of the Southwest, wiped out by trapping and habitat loss. And now the same creatures were being pitched as the key to repairing a broken landscape. The idea made sense when you think about it. Beavers are natural water engineers. They slow streams, trap rainfall, and create pools that can support everything from insects to deer. If they could transform cold northern forests, maybe they could coax life back into these dry valleys too. The problem was obvious. There was barely any water for them to work with. Most of the release sites were cracked soil, trickles of water running through narrow channels. Still, scientists hoped that even a little moisture could be enough. Beavers are resourceful. They dig to reach hidden water, move sediment, and catch every drop that flows through. If they survived long enough, they might stabilize the streams before they disappeared entirely. Early reports made it clear the goal wasn't to create lush ponds or perfect wetlands. The mission was survival: keep the desert from collapsing further, help struggling fish, attract migratory birds, and give native plants a fighting chance. Thousands of beavers, placed carefully across the desert, might just tip the balance in favor of life. The desert stayed silent at first, offering no clear answer to whether the idea would collapse or take root. But quietly, almost reluctantly, subtle changes began to ripple across the release sites. Beavers in the wrong habitat. The moment wildlife managers let the beavers loose in the dry corners of the American West, doubt hung in the air. These were animals made for cool riverbanks, steady streams, and forests thick with willow, aspen, and cottonwood. None of that existed here. The ground was cracked and blistered, the air dusty, and plants so sparse they offered little shelter or food. Even veteran biologists weren't sure the beavers could last. Some predicted they would wander off, looking for better conditions. Others feared the desert heat might overwhelm them before they ever reached water. The first trips to check on the animals only confirmed the challenge. Rangers saw the beavers pausing at the edges of the release sites, unsure whether to stay. Streams were barely more than thin trickles by late summer. Trees were scarce, meaning fewer sticks for lodges and less food. Critics felt vindicated, convinced the project had underestimated the water a single family of beavers needed to survive. Then something strange began to happen. Instead of fleeing, some beavers started exploring the tiny channels that remained. They traced every curve, tested the coldest pockets of water, and nudged the banks with their paws. Their instinct to shape their world didn't disappear just because the desert looked impossible. Field notes describe them packing mud, dragging sticks, and slowing the faintest trickles of water, doing what they could with what little the land offered. Scientists couldn't ignore it. The beavers weren't thriving, but they weren't leaving either. Yet just as scientists and rangers began to wonder whether the beavers' stubborn hold meant something hopeful, the desert delivered its first real trial. What happened next would push every surviving colony to the edge. The initial shock. The first few months after the relocation were hard to watch. Rangers checking on the new beaver colonies saw the animals moving slowly, panting under the desert sun, and digging relentlessly for any sign of water hidden in the dry soil. The beavers tunneled into soft patches, searching for the faint traces of groundwater that sometimes lingered below. In wetter forests, this digging usually helps them reach cooler mud for building lodges. Here it was a battle just to survive. Field notes described them moving back and forth through shallow channels that barely resembled streams, digging and testing every inch of the arid ground. Some tried to build small mud mounds as the start of lodges, only to watch them collapse within hours as the soil baked dry. Observers began to wonder if the whole plan had been a mistake. Could these animals handle the brutal heat swings and the sparse food supply? Mortality was high. Many of the newly released beavers didn't survive the summer. Some succumbed to dehydration under the relentless sun. Others starved because the few patches of willow and cottonwood were too scattered to support growing families. Wildlife managers recorded every loss carefully, not to assign blame, but to understand what was happening in real time. Disappointment spread. Some officials quietly pushed to halt the relocation before more beavers were lost. Yet even in the middle of failure, a few scattered colonies kept going. Their persistence was unexpected, forcing scientists to keep watching instead of abandoning the experiment. It was too early to call it a success, but also too early to give up on the tiny signs of resilience starting to appear. The losses mounted, hope thinned, and the experiment looked doomed. Then, during one of the routine checks, a quiet pattern began to surface. It wasn't dramatic, not at first, but it hinted that the beavers were adapting in ways no report had prepared scientists to understand. The secret underground. What caught field researchers off guard was how fast the beavers moved from merely struggling to figuring out ways to cope. These animals were known for building dams and lodges, but in the desert, they leaned heavily on another skill that often gets overlooked. They began carving out bank burrows along the edges of the small streams and shallow channels that still held pockets of moisture. Unlike the large stick lodges seen in northern forests, these burrows were dug directly into the soil and extended far enough to reach cooler, damp layers underground. In normal environments, bank burrows give beavers a safe place to rest and raise kits. In the desert, the burrows became something more. Rangers who examined the areas noticed that the freshly dug tunnels held onto moisture far longer than the exposed ground. Even when the surface looked completely dry, the soil inside the burrows remained cool. These burrows became small shelters where the beavers could escape the heat and save energy. They also reached narrow pockets of groundwater, which even desert plants depended on to survive. Over time, the effects of this underground activity became visible on the surface. Small clusters of grasses appeared near burrow entrances. A few patches of willow saplings that had been struggling before began to show stronger growth. These were not large transformations, but they were noticeable enough to catch the attention of scientists who had been preparing to record more failures. The pattern repeated itself across different release sites. Wherever beavers established stable burrows, the surrounding soil stayed slightly moister. Moist soil supported insects, which attracted birds, which then helped spread seeds. What seemed like ordinary burrowing was quietly helping the soil retain water that would have otherwise vanished. For scientists expecting only decline, these small green patches were the first sign that the desert experiment was starting to show real progress. Vegetation explosion. What began as tiny pockets of moisture around the burrows slowly started to make themselves known. Rangers walking the release sites began spotting shoots of green in places that had looked dead for years. No one had planted them. The plants were responding to the subtle ways the beavers were altering the ground. Each time a beaver dug a channel or shifted sediment, it loosened compacted soil that hadn't been touched in decades. Seeds already in the earth suddenly found a chance to sprout. In dry regions, soil conditions can make or break plant survival. Hard, packed layers often block roots from reaching the hidden water below. The beavers' digging cracked through those layers, giving roots a path downward. As the soil loosened, it held moisture longer and allowed plants to tap into the scarce water that remained. The recovery didn't happen all at once. It started as thin lines of green tracing the paths of the beavers' work. Small clusters of native grasses appeared near shallow waterways, stabilizing the soil and reducing erosion when rare rains fell. Soon, shrubs like rabbit brush and young willow began to pop up. Their presence showed the land was holding on to water longer than it had in years. This green surge sparked a quiet chain reaction. Plants created shade, which kept the soil cooler. Cooler soil held more moisture. More moisture supported more plants. Each addition strengthened the next, creating a ripple of life across areas long thought beyond hope. For the researchers watching it all, these subtle shifts revealed something. The beavers were influencing more than the streams. They were quietly transforming the very foundation of the desert ecosystem, one small burrow at a time. A water miracle. The first real change in the desert came when the beavers had gathered enough sticks, mud, and stones to build small dams. They weren't the massive structures seen in northern forests, just modest clusters along the shallow channels that carried the occasional seasonal water. Even so, they worked exactly as nature intended. Rain and runoff that would normally vanish in hours slowed and pooled. What had been shallow, fleeting puddles now lingered long enough to soak the banks and form small, clear pools. Wildlife noticed quickly. Insects were first, swarming the damp edges and using the water to breed. That drew small birds that hadn't visited the area in years. Some came to drink, others to hunt the insects. Frogs returned to sites once deemed too dry for generations, taking advantage of water that had suddenly become reliable. The rise in moisture didn't just attract animals. Pools that stayed for weeks gave plant roots a chance to drink deeper. The surrounding soil held together better and vegetation began to thicken. Shade from the new plants helped the water last even longer, creating a quiet cycle of survival that had been missing for decades. What had once been short-lived puddles after storms now persisted through the hottest months. Scientists watching the sites noticed the ripple effect. Birds carried seeds to untouched areas. Frogs kept insects in check. Slowly, a network of life emerged. Centered around the steady water the beavers had coaxed into the desert. For the first time in decades, places once written off as lifeless were supporting an intricate, self-sustaining system of plants and animals. Ripple effects in the food chain. As the new pockets of water and plant life took hold, the desert began drawing animals back that hadn't been seen for years. Predators were the first to appear. Foxes slinked around the fresh pools, moving cautiously along edges they hadn't trodden in ages, as if testing the ground itself. Soon after, coyotes arrived, following the faint scent of prey that had returned to the area. Their tracks traced the edges of shallow ponds held behind the small beaver dams. High above, raptors circled, scanning the underbrush for movement where none had existed before. The return of predators revealed something crucial. If they were back, it meant the lower levels of the food chain were already recovering. Small mammals like mice and voles were among the first to settle in, using the thicker vegetation for cover and relying on the moisture-rich plants for food. The beavers' modifications gave them safe hiding spots and steady access to water, and their numbers began to rise. Reptiles followed suit. Lizards and snakes slithered into cooler ground near the ponds, taking shelter among dense clusters of plants. Insects thrived in the damp soil, drawing birds and other wildlife into the growing ecosystem. Researchers noticed a subtle but powerful pattern. Each returning animal added another layer of balance. Coyotes kept rodent populations in check. Birds carried seeds into areas that hadn't yet healed. Even the predators helped maintain the ponds, moving through the terrain and preventing any single species from dominating. What had started with tiny pools built by a handful of determined beavers quietly triggered a domino effect. Slowly, the desert that had seemed lifeless was coming back to life. A network of water, plants, and wildlife knitting itself together in ways no one had expected. Beavers as ecosystem engineers. As scientists kept returning to the once dead patches of desert, a pattern began to emerge. Slowly, the beavers were bringing life back to stretches of land that had been barren for decades. A single colony could shape miles of dry ground through digging, building tiny dams, and shifting soil and plants. Bit by bit, they formed chains of wet pockets, almost like stepping stones across the arid landscape. Stormwater that once vanished within minutes was now being caught, slowed, and spread across a wider area. Researchers mapping these changes noticed the effects reached far beyond the small ponds. Groundwater rose slightly around each basin, giving nearby plants a fighting chance to survive dry spells. Over time, these plants crept outward, forming thin ribbons of green through valleys that had seemed hopeless. Land previously marked as severely damaged began showing signs of recovery within just a few seasons. Watching this unfold in a semi-arid desert challenged long-held assumptions. Experts had long believed that areas this dry could only recover with heavy machinery, irrigation canals, or expensive water projects. Yet the beavers were accomplishing similar results using nothing but instinct, persistence, and constant effort. Their work became a benchmark for restoration discussions. The animals operated continuously without fuel, crews, or schedules. Their small dams adjusted naturally because the beavers were always checking water levels, repairing failures, and working with the flow of the land. The result was a self-sustaining system that adapted to seasonal changes instead of fighting against them. What started as a risky experiment was quietly proving that even in harsh deserts, nature could engineer its own recovery, if given the right spark and a few determined architects. Long-term soil benefits. As the beavers settled into the desert, something unexpected began to happen, changes that went far beyond water or plants. The soil itself was quietly transforming. Every dig, every stick dragged, every bit of mud moved helped hold the ground in place. Winds and sudden flash floods that once stripped the desert bare now met resistance. Soil that had baked into hard, lifeless sheets began to loosen, allowing fleeting rains to sink in instead of vanishing instantly. Organic matter started appearing where none had been before. Beavers hauled branches, leaves, and other debris into their lodges and burrows. Over time, this material decomposed, quietly feeding the earth with nutrients. Small shoots of grass and stubborn shrubs began appearing in areas that had seemed impossible. Scientists watched in disbelief as pockets of fertile soil emerged from what had been a dry, barren landscape. Water itself started behaving differently. Cracked ground that once shed rain like a mirror now soaked it up and held it longer. Even in the harshest dry spells, tiny pockets of damp soil lingered near beaver activity. Plants, insects, and small animals found a lifeline in these hidden reservoirs, surviving stretches where no surface water existed. A pattern began to emerge. These patches of green slowly linked together, forming a subtle network of oases. Each new sprout made it easier for seeds carried by birds and rodents to take root nearby. Life began creeping outward, one step at a time. Researchers realized the beavers were doing more than sustaining a few ponds. They were quietly laying the groundwork for a larger recovery, turning barren desert into a connected web of damp soil and vegetation. What had started as small, almost desperate interventions multiplied into a system capable of supporting a surprising range of plants and animals. The beavers had transformed the desert floor, creating pockets of life where none should exist, quietly crafting the beginnings of a resilient oasis network. Skepticism meets wonder. When word spread about what the beavers were doing, local ranchers and residents couldn't believe their eyes. Areas that had once been dry and barren were now dotted with small ponds, green patches of grass, and clusters of shrubs. One rancher, surveying the scene, remarked that he never imagined the desert could support so much life again. People had grown used to the idea that this land was too harsh, too hot, and too dry for anything meaningful to survive. Seeing water and vegetation return sparked genuine surprise. Scientists and ecologists were equally fascinated. They began documenting the colonies, tracking the changes in soil, water retention, and wildlife activity. Every observation seemed to reveal something new about the resilience of ecosystems when left to recover naturally. The beavers were showing that even in areas considered nearly impossible to restore, small changes could have ripple effects across the entire environment. Researchers realized these colonies could serve as a blueprint for other dry regions struggling with degraded landscapes and water scarcity. Skeptics who had predicted failure now watched closely, curious to see what would happen next. Some of the early critics even adjusted their own projects based on what they observed in the desert. The experiment became a real-world classroom, demonstrating how nature, when supported in small ways, could rebuild itself in surprising patterns. Local communities also began to take notice. People started to see potential benefits for livestock, native plants, and local wildlife. There was a growing respect for the quiet work of these animals, which had gone largely unnoticed at first. While ranchers marveled at ponds returning and shrubs reappearing, scientists started exchanging uneasy glances. The desert forever changed. Looking at satellite images taken decades after the first beavers were released, the changes are impossible to ignore. Areas that were once bare and cracked with heat now show streaks and clusters of green. Patches of grass, shrubs, and small trees stretch along waterways, tracing the paths the beavers carved through the desert. What was once considered lifeless now supports a variety of animals, from birds to amphibians, reptiles, and small mammals. The transformation is striking because it happened in one of the harshest climates in the United States. At the time of the experiment, many called it reckless. Moving beavers into dry, nearly waterless areas seemed like a guaranteed failure. Early reports warned that the animals would die off, leaving nothing but wasted effort behind. Yet the resilience of the beavers, combined with their natural behaviors, proved everyone wrong. By digging, building, and shaping the land, they created water retention systems, improved soil fertility, and provided habitats that allowed plants and animals to return. Ecologists now view this project as a benchmark for restoration work in dry regions. It showed that carefully guided species reintroduction can achieve results faster and more efficiently than expensive engineering projects. Conservation programs across North America and even internationally reference the experiment as an example of how one species can trigger widespread ecological recovery. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.